The wind whispered through the tall grass, bending it low as if sharing secrets with the earth. The ranch stood alone under the wide, endless sky, its fences weathered by years of sun and storm. Inside the small, sturdy house, a man moved quietly, his footsteps slow, his hands rough from work. His name was John, though no one had called him by it in a long time. He was a man of few words, not because he had nothing to say, but because the words had dried up inside him long ago, buried with the memories he no longer let himself touch. Each day was the same: wake before dawn, tend to the animals, mend what needed mending, eat in silence, sleep when the last light faded. The ranch was his world, and he was its only keeper. The cows knew his movements, the horses recognized his scent, and the old dog, gray around the muzzle, followed him without needing a command. There was comfort in the routine, in the certainty of chores that left no room for thinking. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a knock came at the door. It was a sound so unfamiliar that John paused, his hands stilling over the harness he was repairing. No one came this far out unless they were lost or looking for trouble. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and walked to the door with slow, measured steps. When he opened it, he saw a woman standing there, her dress dusty from the road, her face tired but calm. She carried nothing but a small cloth bundle, tied with string. Her eyes met his, steady and quiet, like she was used to being looked at, but not always seen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was soft but clear, she said, "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." Something in those words, simple as they were, settled into the silence between them. Maybe it was the way she didn't ask for anything more, or the way she held herself, like she understood the weight of being alone. John studied her face, the calluses on her hands, the way her shoulders didn't slump despite the weariness in her eyes. He didn't know her story, and she didn't offer it. But in that moment, he knew two things. She needed a place, and he had one. He stepped aside, just enough to let her in, and said the words that would change both their lives. "You're hired, and you're home." The door closed behind her, and the wind outside sighed, as if the land itself had been waiting for this. The first light of dawn crept through the kitchen window, painting the worn wooden table in pale gold as Martha moved silently through the unfamiliar space. Her hands, though unfamiliar with the placement of pots and pans, worked with quiet certainty, stoking the fire, measuring flour, kneading dough with a rhythm that spoke of years spent in other kitchens, other lonely places. The scent of coffee and baking bread began to fill the air, rich and warm, seeping into the cracks of the old ranch house like something long forgotten. John paused in the doorway, his frame filling the space as he watched her work. He had risen before the sun, as always, expecting the same empty silence that greeted him every morning. Instead, he found the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft hiss of grease in a skillet, the faint hum of a tune without words that Martha didn't seem to realize she was making. It should have felt strange, this intrusion into his solitude. But as he stepped forward and she wordlessly pushed a steaming cup of coffee toward him, black, just as he took it, he realized it didn't feel like an intrusion at all. Days passed in this way, the two of them moving around each other, like planets in a slow, steady orbit. John noticed how she saved the crusts of bread for the chickens, how she always wiped the stove clean before she left the kitchen. Martha learned the rhythm of his comings and goings when he would return from the fields, which tools he preferred for which tasks, the way his jaw tightened when a fence post refused to budge. They spoke little, and yet somehow they spoke all the time, in the way she left his plate warming by the fire when he was late, in the way he repaired the loose step on the porch without being asked. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, John found himself at the table long after supper was finished, watching as Martha mended a tear in his old work shirt. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric with quick, sure strokes, her fingers deft despite their roughness. He thought of all the times he had sewn his own clothes back together, hasty stitches that held but never lasted. There was care in her work, a patience he hadn't known in years. Without a word, He reached for the lantern and turned the wick higher, casting more light over her hands. She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly before she bent back to her task. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, and the old dog sighed in his sleep by the hearth. Inside, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of things neither of them knew how to say and yet, somehow, didn't need to. Winter descended upon the ranch like a great exhale, settling over the land with a stillness so profound it seemed even time hesitated to move forward. The first snow came softly in the night, dusting the fences and rooftops in white, muffling the world beyond the walls of the house. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low but steady, its glow painting the room in flickering amber as Martha stood by the window, watching the flakes spiral down from the iron-gray sky. Behind her, John sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, the steam from his coffee curling upward like a ghost of warmth in the chilled air. There was a new rhythm to their days now, shaped by the season, the mornings spent breaking ice from the troughs, the afternoons devoted to mending harnesses and tools that would be needed come spring, the evenings filled with the quiet companionship of shared meals and the occasional rare conversation that stretched longer than either expected. Martha had taken to preparing hearty stews, the kind that simmered for hours, filling the house with rich aromas that clung to the walls and lingered in their clothes. John found himself looking forward to them in a way he hadn't anticipated, not just for the warmth they brought to his belly, but for the way they seemed to soften something inside him, something he'd long thought frozen beyond reach. One such evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in protest against the cold, Martha set a bowl before him thick with meat and potatoes, flecked with herbs she'd dried herself last autumn. He took a bite, and the taste of it, deep and familiar, sent a sudden, unexpected pang through his chest. For a moment, he was a boy again, sitting at his mother's table, the world still whole and unbroken. The memory was so vivid, he nearly spoke it aloud, nearly, but not quite. Instead, he looked up to find Martha watching him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and something in her gaze told him she already knew. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the fire had burned down to embers, they sat in the dim light, the silence between them heavier than usual. It was Martha who broke it, her voice so quiet it barely stirred the air. "I had a family once," she said, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. "Not by blood, but by choice. They're gone now." She didn't elaborate, and John didn't ask. He understood the spaces between her words, the things left unsaid. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as though disused. "I lost mine too," he said, the words scraping free like stones dragged from the earth. "Long time ago." He didn't say more, couldn't. Not yet, but the weight of the admission settled between them, not as a burden, but as a kind of offering. Martha nodded once, slow and solemn, and in that moment, something shifted. The past was still there, still aching, but it no longer stood like a wall between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the fire burned a little brighter, and for the first time in years, the house felt less like a shelter and more like a home. The thaw came suddenly, as it often did in that country, a warm wind cutting through the winter's grip with impatient fingers, turning frozen earth to mud and coaxing the first tentative green shoots from their slumber. The ranch awoke slowly, shaking off the weight of snow like an old dog rising from its bed. John was out before dawn most mornings now, checking fences weakened by ice, counting cattle that had weathered the storms, his breath still visible in the lingering chill. Martha watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for the day's bread, her fingers pressing and folding with practiced ease, her mind turning over tasks that needed doing, the garden to be planned, the winter stores to be tallied, the mending pile that never seemed to shrink no matter how many socks she darned or seams she reinforced. They had fallen into a new pattern with the changing season, one that required fewer words than ever. When John needed an extra hand holding a fence post upright, Martha was already there, bracing her shoulder against the wood without being asked. When she carried buckets of water from the well, She'd find the path already cleared of debris, the stones placed just so to keep her boots from slipping in the mud. It was as if they had developed their own language, one made of gestures and glances and the quiet understanding that comes when two people have weathered something together. Then the storm hit, not a winter gale, but a spring tempest that rolled in from the west with thunder growling in its belly and rain that fell in sheets, turning the creek into a roaring beast and the pastures into shallow lakes. John was out in it before Martha could protest, his hat pulled low against the downpour, his coat already dark with water. She saw him through the rain-blurred window, struggling to lead the panicked milk cow away from the rising water near the creek bank. Without thinking, Martha grabbed her shawl and ran out into the deluge, the cold rain soaking through her clothes in an instant, her boots sinking into the grasping mud. There was no time for words, even if the storm had allowed them. John's eyes met hers across the distance, and in that look past everything they needed to know, he would brace against the current. She would keep the rope taut. The cow bellowed in fear, its eyes rolling white, but between them they held fast, muscles straining against the pull of the water and the animal's terror. The rope burned Martha's palms, the rain stung her face, but she didn't let go. John's boots slid in the mud, but he dug in harder, his jaw set like stone. When it was over, when the cow stood safe on high ground, shivering but unharmed, they stood there for a moment in the still falling rain, breathing hard, their clothes heavy with water. John reached out then, not to speak, but to carefully pry the rope from Martha's raw fingers, his own hands gentle despite their roughness. She let him, watching as he coiled the rope with slow, tired movements, his face unreadable in the fading light. Back inside, dripping on the hearthstones, Martha handed John a dry blanket without a word. He took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and something passed between them in that touch, not just gratitude, but recognition. They had faced down the storm together, not with speeches or declarations, but with silent, stubborn determination. The fire crackled, steam rising from their clothes, and for the first time since the rain began, Martha realized she wasn't cold at all. The next morning dawned clear, the world washed clean and sparkling. The repaired fence stood straight, the cow grazed contentedly in the pasture, and when John came in from his morning rounds, he found his usual cup of coffee waiting, and beside it, an extra biscuit, still warm from the oven. He ate it slowly, savoring each bite, while Martha pretended not to notice the way his shoulders had lost some of their habitual tension. Outside, the first meadowlark of spring sang its bright song, and the ranch, for all its weathered boards and patched roofs, seemed to stand a little taller in the morning sun. The land shook off the last remnants of winter's grasp with a quiet insistence, the once muddy paths hardening underfoot as wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth in shy clusters of color. Spring on the ranch was not the gentle awakening of poets' tales, but a relentless call to labor, fields to be tilled, seeds to be sown, livestock to be tended with the urgency of seasons that waited for no man. John rose each morning with the first pale streaks of dawn, his body moving through the rituals of work with the steady certainty of a man who'd spent more years with the land than without it. Yet now, for the first time in memory, his solitude was punctuated by another presence, one whose quiet industry matched his own. Martha had claimed the overgrown kitchen garden as her domain, attacking the tangled weeds with a determination that left her knuckles scraped and her skirts streaked with dirt. She worked without complaint, her hands growing rougher by the day, her sun-browned face often shielded beneath the wide brim of John's spare hat. He watched her sometimes from a distance, noting the way she paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist before bending back to her task, her movements economical and sure. She never asked for help, but he found himself leaving tools where she might need them, a sharper hoe leaned against the fence, a bucket of water placed in the shade. Their unspoken collaboration extended beyond the garden. When the old plow horse threw a shoe, Martha was the one to bring John the leather gloves he preferred for farrier work, holding the restless animal's halter with surprising strength while he drove the nails home. When a sudden downpour threatened the newly cut hay, they raced against the darkening sky together, Martha pitching bundles onto the wagon with a speed that belied her slight frame, John driving the team at a pace just shy of reckless. They worked until the last forkful was safely in the barn loft, their clothes damp with sweat and rain, their breathing ragged, but when their eyes met across the dim interior of the barn, there was no mistaking the shared satisfaction in that glance. Evenings found them on the porch more often now, the lengthening daylight stretching their hours of productivity. Martha shelled peas or mended socks while John cleaned tack or whittled replacement parts for broken tools. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or the progress of the crops. One such night, as fireflies blinked lazily in the gathering dark, Martha set aside her darning and reached for the guitar that had hung untouched on the wall since John's youth. Her fingers found the chords hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, as a simple melody filled the space between them. John stilled his whittling knife, the wood in his hands forgotten, as the music wrapped around him like a long-lost memory. He didn't recognize the tune, but something in its bittersweet cadence spoke to the quiet places inside him that words never reached. When the last note faded into the night, Martha simply returned the guitar to its place and picked up her mending as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. John resumed his carving, but his strokes were slower now, more deliberate, as if the music had altered the rhythm of his thoughts. The next morning brought an unexpected gift. Martha found a new pair of gardening gloves on the workbench, the leather supple and sturdy, clearly chosen by someone who understood the toll of constant labor. She ran her fingers over them thoughtfully before slipping them on, flexing her hands to test the fit. They were perfect. When John came in for the noon meal, she said nothing about the gift, but the extra helping of potatoes on his plate and the way she'd taken care to brown the crust of his pie just so spoke volumes in the language they'd crafted between them. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to show the marks of their shared efforts. The garden rows stood neat and thriving, the fields greened with promising shoots, the once leaning barn door swung true on its new hinges. The work was endless, the challenges many, but for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither faced them alone. The land demanded everything they had to give, but in return, it gave them something unexpected, a partnership forged not in grand declarations, but in the quiet accumulation of shared sunrises, exchanged favors, and the unshakable knowledge that when the next storm came, there would be someone standing beside them to face it. The summer sun hung heavy in the sky, a relentless orb of heat that baked the earth into cracked patterns and turned the air above the pastures into shimmering waves. Cicadas droned their endless song from the scrub oaks as John guided the plow through the west field, the muscles in his back burning with the strain of keeping the blade at just the right depth in the stubborn soil. Sweat carved clean trails through the dust on his face, his shirt sticking to his skin like a second layer. At the field's edge, Martha worked steadily through the irrigation ditches, her movements methodical as she cleared the channels of debris with a long-handled hoe, the rhythmic scrape of metal against earth keeping time with the cicada's hum. They had fallen into the rhythm of high summer with the same quiet efficiency that marked all their shared endeavors, rising before dawn to beat the worst of the heat, working through the golden hours of morning before retreating to the shade during the day's fiercest blaze, then returning to their labors as the sun began its slow descent. The ranch demanded everything they had to give during these fleeting months of growth, and neither complained, for they understood the stakes. The difference between a full winter larder and an empty one lay in these sweat-soaked days of unrelenting effort. It was on one such afternoon, when the heat lay thick as wool over the land, that a stranger appeared at the edge of the north pasture. John spotted him first, a lean figure moving slowly along the fence line, his steps uneven, his hat clutched in hands that looked too large for his thin wrists. Martha, wiping her brow with the back of her sleeve, followed John's gaze and saw the way his shoulders tensed beneath his sweat-darkened shirt. Strangers were rare this far from town, and rarely brought good news. The man stopped a respectful distance away when John approached, his eyes downcast but not cowed. Up close, he was younger than he'd first appeared, though hardship had etched premature lines around his mouth and eyes. "Name's Henry," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Looking for work, if you've got any." There was something in the way he held himself, not quite defiance, but the wary readiness of a man accustomed to being turned away. John studied him in silence, taking in the worn boots, the faded shirt with its frayed collar, the way Henry's fingers worried the brim of his hat. Martha came to stand beside John, her presence quiet but undeniable. Without speaking, she took in the hollows beneath Henry's cheekbones, the sunburn on the back of his neck where his collar had gaped. When she turned toward the house, John knew she was going to fetch food before he'd even made his decision. Henry proved himself quickly. Though clearly weakened by hunger and hard travel, he worked with a desperate determination that spoke of more than just the need for wages. When John showed him how to repair the sagging corral gate, Henry watched with sharp attention, his hands mimicking the motions before he even touched the tools. When Martha set him to weeding the vegetable patch, he didn't stop until every last intruder had been pulled, his fingers stained green with their juices. At supper that night, he ate with the careful restraint of someone fighting not to devour everything in sight, his eyes flicking up occasionally as if waiting for reprimand. John saw the way Martha left the bread within Henry's easy reach, how she casually refilled his water glass when he wasn't looking. He noticed, too, how Henry's shoulders gradually lost their defensive hunch over the days that followed, how his work grew less frantic and more measured as regular meals and rest did their quiet work. The ranch seemed to absorb him as it had absorbed them, all the rhythm of chores, the satisfaction of visible progress, the bone-deep tiredness that came from honest labor. One evening, as Henry repaired harness straps by lantern light in the barn, John found himself pausing in the doorway, watching the younger man's sure hands work the leather. There was a story there in those calluses and scars, one John didn't ask for and Henry didn't offer. But when Henry looked up and met John's gaze, there was something new in his eyes, not gratitude exactly, but the first fragile shoots of something like belonging. Martha saw it too. She began leaving small gifts, an extra piece of pie wrapped in cloth for Henry's lunch pail, a new shirt made from leftover fabric placed neatly on his bunk. Neither she nor John spoke of the change that had come over their little household, but it was there in the way Henry started rising early to milk the cows without being asked, in the way he repaired the loose shingle over Martha's garden shed before she could mention it needed fixing. The summer wore on, the days growing shorter by imperceptible degrees. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, the fields yielded their bounty, the livestock grew fat on good pasture, the storeroom shelves grew heavy with jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. And if sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Henry's fingers strayed to the harmonica in his pocket, but didn't quite bring it to his lips, or if John's gaze grew distant watching the sunset over the western ridge, or if Martha's hands stilled in her mending as she listened to the coyotes call, well, that was just the way of things. Healing came in its own time, in its own way, and the land was patient with all of them. By the time the first maple leaves began to blush red at the edges, Henry no longer slept with his boots by his bed ready for a quick departure. His place at the table felt as natural as if he'd always been there, and when visitors from town occasionally stopped by, they referred to the three of them as the folks out at the old Wilson place, as if they'd always been a unit. The ranch had that way about it, taking in the lost and the broken and offering them not just shelter but purpose. And purpose, as they were all learning, could be its own kind of redemption. The harvest moon hung low and heavy over the ranch, casting the weathered buildings in a golden glow that softened their rough edges and turned the fields into a sea of shimmering silver. The air carried the rich, earthy scent of ripe grain and the last of summer's wildflowers, mingling with wood smoke from the hearth where Martha stood, rolling out pie crust with practiced hands. Outside, the laughter of men's voices drifted through the open window. John and Henry hauling the final wagon load of pumpkins from the north field, their boots kicking up dust that hung suspended in the amber light. The dog, once a skittish stray, but now a permanent fixture at Henry's heels, barked excitedly as it chased after a wayward chicken, its tail wagging with the uncomplicated joy of a creature that had finally found its place. The kitchen table, once barely large enough for two, now groaned under the weight of a harvest feast: roasted meats, steaming loaves of bread, jars of honey glowing like liquid sunlight, and vegetables from the garden Martha had coaxed into abundance. It was more food than John had seen in his house in years, more noise than these walls had contained in decades. As Martha slid the pie into the oven, she paused to watch through the window as John clapped Henry on the shoulder, a gesture so natural it might have been years in the making rather than months. The sight sent a quiet warmth through her chest, one that had nothing to do with the oven's heat. When they gathered around the table that evening, the dog curled at their feet and the lantern light pooling in the spaces between them, there was a fullness to the silence that hadn't been there before. Henry told a story about a runaway mule he'd once known, his hands painting pictures in the air, his voice gaining confidence with each sentence. John chuckled a rough, unfamiliar sound that seemed to surprise even him, and Martha hid a smile behind her napkin. The pie, when she served it, was perfect flaky crust giving way to sweet, spiced apples that tasted like the essence of autumn itself. John took a bite and closed his eyes for a moment, as if committing the flavor to memory. When he opened them, his gaze met Martha's across the table, and in that look passed all the words they'd never needed to say. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the fire burned low, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast country sky. Henry strummed the old guitar quietly, his calloused fingers finding chords Martha had taught him on those long summer evenings. The dog sighed contentedly at their feet, and from the pasture came the occasional soft nicker of the horses settling for the night. John rocked slowly in his chair, the creak of the wood keeping time with the cricket song, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been when Martha first arrived at his door all those months ago. The ranch had given them all something, not just shelter, not just work, but a second chance at the kind of belonging that didn't require blood ties or grand speeches. It was in the way Henry now referred to the West pasture as ours, the way Martha no longer flinched at unexpected touches, the way John's solitary routines had gradually made space for others without losing their essential rhythm. The house, once an outpost of loneliness, had become something else entirely, a place where silence was companionable rather than heavy, where the smell of fresh bread meant homecoming, where the future no longer stretched ahead like an endless, empty road. As the last notes of Henry's playing faded into the night, Martha looked around at their little gathering, the mismatched family they'd somehow become, and knew with quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The seasons would turn, the work would continue, and the ranch would demand their sweat and strength as it always had. But they would meet those demands side by side, their lives woven together as surely as the baskets Martha mended or the fences John and Henry repaired. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas below, but here on this patch of earth, something remarkable had taken root. It wasn't perfect, no life ever was, but it was theirs. And that, Martha thought as she leaned back in her chair and let the peace of the moment settle over her, was more than enough. The end. If you enjoyed this heartfelt journey of quiet love and unexpected bonds, be sure to subscribe for more moving tales of resilience, redemption, and the healing power of found family. Let these stories warm your heart. Hit subscribe now so you never miss a new chapter.